Hello and welcome to Cloud Security Podcast with Virtual Coffee with Ashish. This is where we hang out and talk about cloud security things. And this month is Kubernetes Security Month. So we're going to talk about Kubernetes security. Today's topic, as I bring that up, is going to be about if you're thinking about starting to learn cybersecurity, you should use this video to start your journey in cybersecurity or specifically Kubernetes security. And today we have a special guest who's been doing a lot of research on this. So without further ado, I'm going to bring them in. But before we do this, if you have here for the first time, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you are watching this on LinkedIn, follow our LinkedIn channel because that's how you get notified of the new channel coming in. All right, so today, before I can go into it, I want to thank the sponsor as well, which I think Nate does better than I do. So I'm going to bring on Nate.
Hey, Ashish and Cloud Security Podcast listeners. Thanks for giving Exonius the opportunity to sponsor the show. Exonius does exactly three things. By connecting to existing data sources, Exonius gives customers a comprehensive asset inventory, both cloud and on-prem. It then uncovers security gaps, and finally, it automatically validates and enforces policies. Thanks again, and check us out at exonius.com.
Thanks for that, Logan. And thanks for that, Nate. I was thinking on Logan already. So that's the episode. And let me just bring on my guest. But before I do, as a tradition, I'm going to bring my handy music. Hey.
Hello.
Hey, Magno.
How's it going?
Hey. Thanks for coming in the cup as well. Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah. Cheers.
You know, tell people as well, what is that drink?
It's Space Invaders beer, IPA.
Space IPA. Oh, yeah. Nice. Mm-hmm. Wait, so we also spoke about the Brazilian sugarcane drink.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have that as well?
Yeah, I have that set up here.
Oh, I feel like I need to take a shot with you. So I'm gonna pour a little bit of my vodka in here. But
okay, sounds good.
We'll see how we go. I don't have a short cup, but cheers, man. Thanks for coming on the show.
Cheers.
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 Woo.
Woo. Nice.
I think we'll definitely have a great conversation today. I don't think people realize we're having alcohol for the first time on this show. So, as in, like, not for the first time. I'm definitely having alcohol on this show for the first time. So, thank you for bringing that. But I'm going to start with the obvious here. For people who don't know Magno, who's Magno? How'd you get to where you are today, man?
Sure. Okay. So yeah, my background is on development, right? Web application development. That's where I got my college degree from. But I was always interested in security. And during my college, I was selected for a scholarship to study in the US for 1 year. I was one of the few Brazilians selected at that time, was 2008, 2009. And so there, I got the opportunity to study some security courses and web application security, computer forensics, and all that stuff. And that really got me really interested into security. So that's when I decided to shift my career into application security, because it was a field that was just starting there at the time, at least in Brazil, where I'm from. So I got back to Brazil. I finished my degree there, and I started doing a postgraduate degree in information security, and started from there, learning about the OWASP, the OWASP Top 10, application security, vulnerabilities, and all that stuff. Yeah,
that's pretty awesome. So wait, I love the fact that you started as a developer and started taking on, I guess, more cybersecurity qualifications. So where do you work now, and what's your current day job like?
Sure. Okay. Currently, I live in Canada. I work for Trend Micro Canada, and I do cloud and container security research. So I'm part of a team that's called, internally, it's called Team Nebula, right? And so it's a small team inside Trend Micro that really focuses on finding vulnerabilities and deploying honeypots and studying attacks that's related to cloud environments, serverless, DevOps tools, and also container and Kubernetes, right? Docker and Kubernetes mostly, yeah.
Interesting. And probably the best person to bring in to talk about Kubernetes security, at least for starting conversation this though. So I normally ask this question quite often because I think you do container and cloud security. So I can probably ask you this as well. What is cloud security for you? Like, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's still something, a concept that's very cloudy to me, and no pun intended there. But
Yeah.
right, it's like, what is the cloud, right? So it's like, okay, is it just someone else's server? It's just another data center. So I think it's a little bit more than that, right? It's using those services as a self-service way. So you can just, okay, you can go to any cloud provider today and just spin up a new instance, deploy a server, right? It has a lot of APIs that you can do automation with. So I think cloud security is protecting those environments that are being created around with the cloud service providers, but are also around this methodology of API first and self-service and elasticity, right? And all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And I love the answer you gave, because I feel like everyone answers in a different way. Because to your point, some people think, oh, hey, it's someone else's server. And some people just go like, no, it's like this data center thing or whatever. So what about Kubernetes then? For some people who might be listening to this episode for the first time, and although this is a Kubernetes month and we've been talking about Kubernetes for some time already, what's your definition of Kubernetes, and what does Kubernetes security mean for you?
Sure. Yeah. So as Docker was created and on launch in 2013, right? So as a way to use containers to deploy your applications and have them kind of isolated and separated in each container there, people start deploying and using that in large scale, right? So like hundreds and thousands of containers. And it was hard to manage, right? So it's like having to make sure that you're controlling and managing all those containers in your environment, and make sure that they're healthy, that they have the proper resources for CPU and memory and all that stuff, and that if something goes down, right, that you need to know so that you can maybe spin up another container or try to fix it, right? So
yeah.
I think that Kubernetes comes to solve this problem here, and I know that there are other solutions out there, but Kubernetes is a way to manage, right? It's a container orchestration solution to manage all those containers in a way that's kind of it does a lot of the managed stuff for you, right? So you don't need to handle like if you deploy Kubernetes and your applications properly on a Kubernetes cluster, it can handle the rollbacks, the updates. If a container goes down, it can create another one from you. It's easy to scale the replicas and also scale down the replicas if you need. So it's a solution to manage all those containers that you need to manage right now.
I love the answer, because it simplified it to what it needs to be, but also it kind of talks about why people care about it so much as well. So what's the role of cloud native in all this then? Why people keep using, if it's just container orchestration, why call it cloud native?
Exactly. So Kubernetes is part of this ecosystem that's called cloud native, right? So cloud native means a group of applications that were born to run on the cloud, right? And so as we discussed what is cloud and cloud security earlier, right? So cloud native means applications that are declarative, that they are API first, that they usually run on containers, right? That they are easy to scale. So all that characteristics are related to cloud native solutions, and Kubernetes is only one product or one tool that's part of this cloud native ecosystem, right? So if you heard about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is a foundation that's a part of the Linux Foundation, there are many other projects that are considered and that are part of the CNCF, right? So Kubernetes is just one of them. And also Kubernetes itself uses other cloud native tools for it to work, right? So you have Core DNS, you have etcd, and many others.
Also, all of those components that people talk about, and I would love to get into some of these components as well, etcd and kubeproxy and all that. I guess some of those components have been derived from a CNCF open source project.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So etcd, core DNS, they're all part of the CNCF ecosystem, right? And they're also considered cloud native tools and cloud native projects.
Interesting. So how would this be different, say, when people deploy Kubernetes in cloud versus on-premise, I guess, or on their own self-hosted one?
Okay. Yeah. So the problem is the complexity, right? So I personally think that Kubernetes is really complex. It took me a bit of time to really understand the ins and outs and the bits inside how Kubernetes work. It's not easy. It has a learning curve that's very complex, right? So I think it really depends on, first, if you have the resources and the people to handle that, right? So for example, okay, yeah, I just need to run a cluster. I just need to run some web applications, right? And I don't want to know about I don't want to manage that cluster, right? So definitely go with the managed solutions that are provided and they're offered by the cloud providers, right? So you have EKS, you have AKS, you have GKE, and many others, right? So because that's easier, you don't need to manage some of the stuff, and the cloud provider takes care for you, right? On the unmanaged, right, or on premises, you have to handle everything. So it's much harder, and you need to have dedicated people like to be your cluster admins that know what and understand, right, what's going on there, right? So I think that's the big difference. There's also some compliance concerns, right? For example, if there are some regulations that don't allow you to use these managed services, right, you're probably gonna have to deploy your own cluster and manage that. So for compliance, for government solutions, you might need to deploy your own cluster as well.
Interesting. And I love the comments coming in as well. So I'm going to quickly acknowledge some of those as well. So Vinny said hello. Gerald said hello. Gerald loves the fact that you've off to a great start with IPA and Cloud Puns already.
Yeah, thank you.
And I hope I pronounced the name right.
Yeah, I'm using it's ice skating glass.
Yeah, I was gonna say that is a very particular glass.
Very Canadian.
Yeah, right. There you go. Well, I need to get one of those souvenirs. And I love the comment from I hope I pronounced his name right. Aitor. Sorry, Aitor. So Kubernetes is so important that it is the foundation of the architecture of 5G and future 6G mobile technologies. Security research in this area is relevant. Wow. Do you know much about the 5G and 6G technology?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they're using Kubernetes for that as well. And there's also another topic that Kubernetes is very it's highly adopted right now. It's Kubernetes on edge, like edge devices, right? So your mobile phone, your IoT devices, they all can be a node or part of a cluster, right? So that's very interesting. Even I've seen people run Kubernetes on Raspberry Pis as well. So you have a cluster of a bunch of Raspberry Pis, and you can run Kubernetes as well.
Oh, thanks. Well, thanks for introducing me to that concept as well. Thanks, man. Really appreciate the comment as well. So now, since we kind of differentiate between the cloud structure as well as I guess self-hosted one, let's get into the grid of I'm a security person, and I've told people that, okay, if you want to use Kubernetes or at least understand Kubernetes security, this is the first point to start. So what are some of the common obvious entry points or that adversaries use as tactics?
Okay.
To, I guess, exploit Kubernetes.
Yeah, so the most common ways that attackers are getting into Kubernetes cluster nowadays, that's what we've seen and what we noticed from our research into also we have a bunch of honeypots, Kubernetes honeypots deployed, right? So we analyze those weekly, and there's two main entry points, right? One is I think the most common one is the API server, right? So if you have the API server exposed to the internet, it doesn't have the proper configurations, or if it's misconfigured, it allows people to deploy pods into your cluster without authentication or with a weak authentication, right? So that's the main point of entry. Attackers are using either your Kubernetes API server if that's exposed, or your Docker daemon API if that's exposed as well, right? So you have to be very careful, even if you're just using Docker and not Kubernetes, to not expose those API endpoints to the internet, right? So that's the main thing. The second entry point of a Kubernetes cluster, it's the application, right? So it's still running a web application that can be vulnerable to many different attacks, right? And so if there is a vulnerability on your application that's running inside a Kubernetes cluster, and I can run commands inside that cluster, inside that pod of where the application is running, right? So I have remote command execution, right? So I can run commands inside the pod. I can get information from the cluster. I can try to break out of the pod and access the node, right? And get the cluster admin and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's still here, even though you're using Kubernetes, you're using containers, application security is still a strong topic, right? You need to be aware. It doesn't matter if your foundation is secure, right? Your containers are secure, your Kubernetes cluster is secure, but then your application is vulnerable, right? Your code is shit, right? Forgive me of using that word, but if you code it, if you don't know how to program and use secure coding approaches on your application, then yeah, there's nothing that Kubernetes can protect you from that.
So good. So API server, totally get it. Docker daemon as well, application as well. So does this vary between, say, having a cloud layer on top of this? Does that make it a difference? Like I don't know, some SSRF in there as well? Would that kind of impact this?
Yeah. So if you're using Kubernetes in the cloud, right, and I compromise a pod inside your cluster, I can reach the API metadata from the pod itself. I don't need to break out of the pod to access the node to get your API keys, right? So your access keys, your secret keys, I can do that from the pod itself. And depending on the permissions of those keys, it's game over, right? So there are situations where attackers compromise your cluster and they either deploy new pods, right, new containers to run crypto miners, usually Monero, or they install the malware, the Monero crypto miner, inside your running pods already, right? Or they break out of your cluster and they deploy new instances on your cloud environment, usually bigger instances that are very expensive, right? And they start mining cryptocurrencies there as well.
Wait, so just for the context of people who may not know what breaking out a container means, what is breaking out a container?
Sure. So breaking out of the container is a form of privilege escalation inside your cluster, right? Breaking out of the container is kind of an isolated process, right? That's protected by the container isolation there, right? So breaking out of the container, accessing the host content, the host files, the host information. So that's kind of a breaking out of the container. And one of the most common ways of breaking out of a pod in a Kubernetes cluster is deploying a privileged pod that has access to your whole node, right? So you're one of your VMs, right? So Kubernetes has the master node or the control plane, which is the main node that controls all the other nodes that we call worker nodes, right? So those nodes are the ones that run your applications. So if I compromise one of that, right, I break out of that, I'm kind of accessing the instance itself. It could be a VM or a bare metal, right? So I'm accessing that. Yeah.
Interesting. So, all right, I've gone through this, and I love the theme that we've picked. We're actually going in the attack direction when it can come back into defense later. So, from a attacker's perspective, okay, I've identified either it's my application security or my Kubernetes API or my Docker daemon API, or it could be access to like a metadata of the whole service, and I've managed to do some form of privilege escalation with escaping the containers. Sounds like there's, to your point about the complexity, there's like so many layers to this, right? Are there like tools out there that I can, like, I don't know, that tells me when's an API publicly available, or am I just sitting on the internet trying every port on the URL, or how do I go about doing some recon on this?
Sure. Yeah. So if depends on your target, right? If you're targeting managed services like from a cloud provider, usually they have specific URL names for those clusters, right? And so you can do some recon on that specific URL format and look for either valid clusters or ping their default the default API ports of the API server. Like, okay, if it's unmanaged, usually it's port 6443. If it's a managed cluster, it's usually on port 443 by default, right? So you can do that. You can also use tools that are available to you, like Shodan or Census, right? That scan the internet already, and you can look for specific indicators that this is a Kubernetes cluster, right? So looking for that specific port, looking for indication that this is a cluster Kubernetes, right? So the API server, when it replies to you, it usually replies in a JSON format, and it has a specific format for the responses, right? So you can check that as well.
Interesting. And I think I've got a follow-up question from Gerald here. Are there specific tools to scan for Kubernetes vulnerabilities as well?
Sure. Yeah, there are many tools out there. I don't think that there's like one single tool that you can do everything. I know that Aqua, which is one company that does a lot of container and Kubernetes security work and research, they have a tool called KubeBench, right? So it's a tool to assess your Kubernetes cluster according to the CIS benchmarks, right? So it's more like a defense tool, right? You need to look to see if you're compliant with the CIS benchmark. And there's also KubeHunter, right? So KubeHunter, then it scans your cluster or a target cluster that you should probably have authorization to scan, right? You should have that, and it's gonna tell you like what is compromised, like what are the vulnerabilities, right? Checks. I think it's 30 to 37 checks of potential vulnerabilities, misconfiguration, information disclosure, everything that in a cluster that shouldn't be exposed, right? So I think that's those are the two main tools. I think there are many other smaller tools that you can use, but still, Kubernetes is API server, right? So it's the main part of the control plane is an API server, right? So you can do either curl requests, you can use some web security testing tools also to assess your Kubernetes cluster as well.
Awesome. And thanks for sharing those tools as well. But I definitely feel there is some more complexity that goes into trying to understand even just the threat landscape for this as well. To your point, this is just one cluster that we focused on when we spoke about API and the container. Is this problem larger in like if you have a massive cluster, like in an enterprise where there's not just one cluster, there's like multiple clusters, right? Like yeah. What's the low-hanging fruits over there for trying to get in? Like, I think what else is there, like a thing that affects multiple clusters?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So everything, right? Kubernetes, it's not a tool on itself, right? It relies on other tools as well. As I mentioned, it has the att&ck, which is the data storage, the database for Kubernetes. It has the core DNS, which is the default tool for networking and communication inside your cluster. So all those tools, you need to be aware of their configurations, know if they're not exposed as well. For example, att&ck also has an API, right? By default, it's not exposed to the internet, but if you're inside the network, right? So one other thing that attackers are doing is they're compromising the network or the cloud environment, and then they're looking internally for Kubernetes clusters, right? So they're already inside. So even if your API server is not exposed, they can do a reconnaissance of the whole network and find API servers that are open inside that network because you think that's protected, right? You think, nobody inside my network is going to attack my cluster, right? But you need to be aware not just of the insider threat, right? But also attackers compromising your network and then scanning for your Kubernetes cluster there.
So, and to your point, etcd being that, I guess for lack of a better word, it's that key value store which has all the cluster information. You could just be like looking out for that API in particular as well.
Exactly. Yeah. If that is exposed, right? If I can communicate with the etcd, so the way that Kubernetes works is on we say it's a declarative state. So I tell Kubernetes what I want, but I don't care how it's gonna do it, right? As long as it does it, right? So either via requests or YAML files, I tell Kubernetes, oh, I want a cluster like that. I want this pods. I want this web application. I want this number of nodes. And I send that to the API server, right? The API server then sends that to etcd, and etcd stores that information there. And then there are some components like the scheduler and the controller manager that checks etcd to see, okay, is what's in etcd right now is what's being reflected on my cluster. Oh no, it's different, right? They don't match, right? It's basically a diff verification, right? Diff comparison. Oh, they don't match. Okay, so we need them to match, right? So now I need to create a pod. I need to create the web application so that what's running on my cluster, it's exactly what's on etcd, right? So that's the big problem, right? If I have access to etcd, I can create the pods, I can create the containers and everything, right? And Kubernetes is going to take care for that for me or for the attacker, right? So that's why etcd is a very sensitive piece in the Kubernetes cluster.
Actually, you're right, because I can tell, like, I'm just trying to think, if you actually had access to the etcd API, you can tell it to point it to launch an application, which is a Docker container or a container that you host in Docker Hub. You can point it there if they allow for it.
Exactly.
Download it, and because you would be in the pod, you can access all the applications anyways, unless there's a policy around it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a good thing that you mentioned, network policies, right? So by default, Kubernetes doesn't implement network policies, right? It's a flat network inside your cluster. Yeah. Any pod can talk to any other pod, and that's a big problem, right? Because if my malicious pod can talk to the Kubernetes API server, which also running as a pod, or the etcd, which sometimes is another pod, right? That's a big problem, right? That's a big problem.
Yeah, I love this, man. So wait, actually, have you seen the ATTACK MITRE thing from Microsoft, right, for Kubernetes? What are your thoughts on that? Like, does that cover, like, I mean, and worthwhile, maybe why don't you introduce what that is, and because in case people don't know what that is, and tell us what your thoughts are on that, if it's actually valid and does a good job.
Okay, so yeah, there's two matrix that there's the Microsoft Kubernetes threat matrix that was created in April last year and was released by Microsoft. The team, I think, is the security team at Azure that released that, right? And then there is now the MITRE, the official MITRE attack for containers, right? So that other matrix, that new matrix that was created by MITRE, is a product of that other Microsoft matrix, right?
Oh,
so Microsoft
okay.
is one of the sponsors of this new project, right? So last year, MITRE has reached out to the community in December last year, asking for real world scenarios and data around what attackers are doing in those containerized and clustered environments, right? So they reach out to the community. We saw their blog post, and our team was one of the first to reach out to them to tell them, okay, here's the research that we've been doing on Docker and Kubernetes for over 2 years now, at least on Docker and Kubernetes since last year. And here's what we've seen. Here's the data from our honeypots, what the attackers are doing and what they're trying to exploit, the commands that they run, the scripts that they use, right? So we provided all that information to MITRE along other organizations as well. And that was what created the MITRE attack for containers, right? So we've been working closely with MITRE since December last year to release that for the community, right? And so we came up with seven techniques from all those tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? We came up with 7 techniques. 5 of them, they already existed on the MITRE Enterprise framework, but they didn't have the focus on containers itself. So they added that focus, right? And there are two other techniques that were brand new. They didn't exist on the MITRE framework yet. So yeah, the MITRE framework, we worked closely with them, and was a great work, great effort since last year. And yeah, it was one of the projects that I was really involved with MITRE, and I helped them to publish that. So that's really nice.
That's pretty awesome. And I think worthwhile calling out, why do you feel, because a lot of people may look at this and go, oh, I don't do pen testing, I don't do bug bounty. Why do I even care about the attack meter or whatever comes out of it? What do you say to those people?
Sure. So I think the MITRE attack framework is a great framework that's widely adopted among the security community right now. And it can be used for both teams, right? The red teams for pen testing, for exploiting vulnerabilities, but also for the blue teams, right? For understanding the attacks, the common attacks on their environments, what threat actors are using, which techniques are they using to attack either the container environment, the cloud environment, right? And you can do also by industry sector, right? Okay, what are the most common threat actors that attack financial sector, right? The government and all that stuff, right? So I think it's a very complex, complete and complex as well matrix, but it can be used both ways, right? You can understand the techniques that they use and like just replicate them to see if they work on your pen testing engagement, right? Or change them a little bit as well. But you can also use that. Okay, so the MITRE, what's very center from MITRE is that they only care about real world scenarios, right? They don't care about theoretical things or things that never happen and nobody exploited in the wild, at least in a honeypot, for example. Okay, so that's what I think what gives value to the matrix is okay. You know what the attackers are using, so you can look for the most used techniques and focus on protecting your environment against those as well.
I love it. And I think to your point, I probably add another reason, if you don't mind. I think what I was going to say was, as a security architect, when I was a security architect ages ago, whenever that was, every time I would try and tell people, hey, we should say, I'm going to use a Kubernetes example, because one of the projects that I was doing with, people were like, what's the problem with having API of Kubernetes on the internet? This is, I'm talking like good 3-4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I remember this very conversation. And the whole point was, because every microservices, people want to make it on the internet. Totally fine with that. Understand, obviously, you have the right controls behind it. But they kind of use the same analogy as a microservice onto a Kubernetes API. That, hey, Kubernetes API should be on the internet. Like, not really sure if it should be on the internet. But one thing that helped me at that point was knowing the Tesla thing that happened, mm-hmm. where there was crypto mining done on a Tesla Kubernetes API server that was exposed on the internet. Yeah. Using that example, I was able to convince people like we should. It does sound like a bad idea to have the API server. So I feel like if a person from a blue team is listening to this and they sometimes struggle with convincing other people because the question that you get from the other side is like, why does it matter? What are people going to do? We want to do on the internet, but the moment you point either a recon method or it's like a tactic that a adversary can use, it goes a long way in convincing. That is if that's what you're trying to do. But we've spoken about attacks for about 30 minutes now, and I want to switch to defense as well. You mentioned mm-hmm. CIS Benchmark.
Exactly.
What thoughts on the CIS Benchmark, and is that an effective tool as a starting point?
Sure. So yeah, the CIS benchmarks, there are many other benchmarks against platforms and applications and solutions out there, right? And so they created one for Kubernetes, the CIS Kubernetes benchmark. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the two main people involved in the creation of the CIS benchmark were Liz Rice and Rory McCune, which are great professionals, and they're very well known around the cloud native and Kubernetes security ecosystem, right? So it's a big document, right? It's a large PDF, and I went through that last year, and it's very complex, but it's because it touches on every single point from your cluster on a best practice. It tells you like, okay, how it should be, right? Okay, it should be this set of permissions, this set of user. It shouldn't be exposed to the internet, right? And it tells you also to check how to check if that's the case on your cluster, right? It tells you the exact commands that you need to run. And it also tells you, okay, if it's not that case on your cluster, here's how to fix it, right? So there's for each item on the CIS benchmark, they have, okay, they explain why it should be like that. They explain for you how to check it, and then they explain for you how to fix it, right? So that's why it's a long document and it has a lot of information there. But yeah, I don't think anybody would go through manually through the benchmark and checking their cluster one by one. So I think that the tool that I mentioned earlier, the KubeBench tool, does that for you in an automated way, right? So you run KubeBench against your cluster, and it's gonna tell you for each item from the CIS benchmarks, which ones are you compliant, and which ones are you're not compliant, right? So I think that's really interesting to do.
Oh, interesting. So to your point, sounds like it requires a certain skill set as well. But so if I've kind of taken on the opportunity, I'm going to go CIS. Is CIS the only thing that people can use to, or KubeBench, you mentioned earlier as well? So apart from CIS and KubeBench, are there obvious patterns when people are trying to implement Kubernetes that they can be looking out for? Like, I think you've already mentioned, at least try and not have Kubernetes API on the internet, because that's
Sure.
makes it more susceptible. Because a lot of the blue teams are tasked with, hey, this is my Kubernetes build. Hey, Mr. Security Architect or Miss Security Architect, tell me what I need to do over here. So what are some of the obvious low-hanging fruits in that scenario?
Sure. Yeah, so the CIS benchmarks would be, I think, the most common one, and I think it's widely adopted already. And the good thing about the CIS benchmark is that it has a benchmark for like a standard Kubernetes, right? If you're doing unmanaged cluster or on premises. But it also has a benchmark for EKS on AWS. It has a separate benchmark for AKS on Microsoft or GKE, I think. But it should have at least 2 or 3 cloud providers there that they have their managed services for Kubernetes, and you have a specific benchmark for that, right? So that's the main thing. Besides that, I know that the Kubernetes SIG security team, that's a group inside Kubernetes that has weekly meetings around the Kubernetes security, and I'm one of members of that group. They're working on a hardening of Kubernetes, right, document, right? So that's still, I think, not publicly available. It's still on a draft mode, but they should be releasing a Kubernetes hardening guide very soon. So, and it's created by the people that work on Kubernetes, on Kubernetes security every day, right? So I think that's really interesting. For other compliances, I would say go to your cloud provider, right? So if you're using a managed services, I know that AWS, Google, and Azure, they probably have a best practice document for using those services, right? So make sure that you take a look at that, because they are a little bit different than your regular Kubernetes deployment, right? So you need to understand those differences as well.
Awesome. And I think Tulio has a question which is kind of linked to similar as well. I think I've kind of answered it, but did you want to add anything to Tulio's question about what's the framework compliance cover Kubernetes security?
I don't think there is any compliance framework. Like if you're talking about PCI or SOX or HIPAA, right? I don't think any of those compliance documents already cover Kubernetes environment. It might cover container environments, right? But I'm not sure. It's been a while since I dealt with those compliance documents. Luckily, so yeah. I would say start with the CIS benchmarks, and if you're using a managed service, check their best practices. I think that's the best recommendation, right? Who else besides their own cloud provider to give best practices and recommendations on their own service, right?
Yeah, and I think maybe another way to ask this question is: have you seen implementations done for, say, every organization would have some form of compliance requirement? usually, right? So to your point, PCI, they've done a PCI deployment of our application. They heard you and I talk about Kubernetes, like, oh my God, Kubernetes is the best thing ever. And they go and deploy the same thing in Kubernetes. Is it possible to apply those compliance frameworks on like a Kubernetes cluster? Have you seen that done? Like apply like a PCI or make something PCI certified if it's on Kubernetes cluster. I know I'm throwing an oddball at you, but Tulio's question kind of struck that, like, I wonder if people are running compliance-driven environments on quote-unquote compliance-driven environments on Kubernetes or in Kubernetes.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. I think that using Kubernetes, it might abstract you some of the requirements that are in your compliance document, right? So you don't need to implement those, right? But then you're also going to rely on your auditor or the person that's checking for your compliance if they understand Kubernetes as well, right? Because they're going to go line by line on that requirement, and they're gonna check, oh, where's the IDS? Where's the firewall? Where's the IPS, right? And you don't have that.
What's the IP?
Exactly, right? So like it's challenging. I don't think anyone has at least publicly done that, but yeah, I would be interested to know more about it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll let Julio. I hope I'm pronouncing his name, his or her name right. And I hope if you have an example you can share with us. But I would be seriously considering an example where someone has built something which requires compliance standards to be filled out in a Kubernetes cluster. That would be because that itself is convincing someone about Kubernetes, even though it's being used in 5G and 6G. That to me would be really interesting at that point. So I think we spoke about some of the frameworks around it, right? And we haven't gone into the supply chain aspect of it as well yet, because I think coming back to the question that I was asking about, where it's like multiple clusters in an organization. Think about like a really large organization. They won't just have one Kubernetes cluster. They'll have multiple Kubernetes clusters floating around everywhere, usually going through a DevOps pipeline or a CI/CD pipeline. Like, what are your thoughts on, I guess, scalability perspective definitely makes sense. But from an attacker perspective, how do you look at like a CI/CD pipeline in this one? What are you looking for in there?
Okay, so yeah, supply chain is a big topic right now. It's a hot topic in the community because of the SolarWinds attack, right? The CodeCov attack as well, and vulnerability. There's also a kind of a supply chain, if I could say that, on the Linux kernel, right, where they try to submit malicious commits to the kernel as well. And lately, with the big news that related to ransomware on the Colonial pipeline in the US, right? So there's also all kinds of things that we can talk about it here. But I think the main point was when Docker Hub was released, people were using that as their main source of container images and container registry, right? They weren't doing like, a private registry or anything. They were relying on Docker Hub to check for security the same way that you're relying on your App Store or Google Play on the apps that you download on your phone, right? So you rely on them. So the same thing that happened. In the beginning, attackers were deploying Docker containers to the Docker Hub and downloading that and making like similar names to famous images, right? So you would download that, and that had a vulnerability. So that has it's almost gone now, right? Because you have tools as container image scanning, and you also have your privacy registries that you should be using for you to avoid those kind of situations, right? So right now, attackers are using regular images from Docker Hub. They download a Alpine image or Ubuntu image, and then they install their malicious tools after they are inside your container environment, your cluster, right? So now it comes to the point of, okay, what are you allowing inside your cluster, right? So now you have the container image scanning, a tool for protecting against bad images getting to your cluster. But now, if it's a good image and like it has some malicious tool that's installed there, right? How do you check for that, right? So now you have on Kubernetes something called admission controllers, right? And as the name says, they control the admission of containers on your cluster, right? They check if your container was scanned properly, if it doesn't have any vulnerabilities. So you define that policy, right? And one famous admission controller here that's being deprecated right now, but that's a good thing. It's the pod security policy, right? It's a bunch of security settings that you can tell your cluster to only allow pods to be deployed on your cluster if they follow those policies, right, and those rules. And now pod security policy is being deprecated, and they're working on a new version of a pod security policy, and I don't think they have a proper name yet. So that's being done also by the Kubernetes SIG security team. But there are other options, right? There are other options out there. There are some tools like OPA, which is Open Policy Agent, that has a specific language, policy language, and they call policy as code by using that Rego language that you can define some policies to allow or block anything on your cluster as well. And there's another tool called Kyverno, which means it's also Greek, same as Kubernetes, and it means govern, right? So it's like a governance or a government of your Kubernetes cluster itself. And it doesn't use a specific language. It just uses YAML files like any Kubernetes cluster. So those are the tools that I think you should check out if you want to protect what goes inside your cluster, right? And later, after you deploy your pods, you need to care about the runtime, right? You need to care about if your cluster is compromised and something was modified later, right? After your pod is deployed, the admission controller won't protect you against that. It's already deployed, it's already running, right? So now you need to care about the runtime and anything that's running on your pods, right? Usually you should have only one process running on your container. Sometimes that's not the case, right? So you need to have a solution that does kind of monitors your pods and also protects against any changes and somebody installing some packages, installing SSH or something like that, right? So I would say that Falco, which is also a cloud native tool and an open source tool, would be the solution to protect against runtime issues on your cluster.
That's a great. I love the answer. And I'm going to ask you to scale it, because great answer when it was one cluster. But as a security person in a large company, I'm dealing with like multiple clusters, man. And like, so I need to have multiple versions of Falco, or like, how would you look at scaling that security thing?
Sure. So I think for scaling, you either need to have multiple versions, or you can try checking out the manage solution. So you have OPA, but OPA is run by a company, right? It's not run, it's supported by this company called Styra, right? Okay. And they have their paid services, which is kind of a managed OPA, where you can have it's a cloud OPA where you have everything on their console, and you can scale that in different clusters and monitor that as well and apply the policies to different things. You can do that yourself, but it's going to require more work, right? Because it's open source, right? If you want to do it for free, then you're going to have to automate that yourself. I think the same thing applies to Falco. I think that the company behind Falco that donated Falco to the CNCF is called SysDig, and they also have their managed services and solutions to scale that out, right? So it depends on your choice. If you have the right people and resources to do that yourself, go for it. If you just want to pay someone to do that for you, and it's like, okay, it's gonna cost you, right? So that's your choice.
So maybe to kind of like bring this a full circle, if you were given the opportunity to deploy a Kubernetes cluster with the right security in it, how would you do it? And I guess, like, what would you consider is a mature solution for a Kubernetes deployment?
First question that I would ask you, or the person asking me to deploy the cluster, is what's going to run inside your cluster, right? Is it just a website? Is it sensitive information? Is it financial information? Like what's inside there, right? What's the value of that information to you, right? Because that's going to determine, that's the first thing that's going to determine how much you want to invest on it, right? On the security of it, right? Yeah. So yeah, besides that, I think a few considerations are in order here. So let's say either using managed or unmanaged. That's the second choice that you're going to have to make. If you don't have a lot of resources and you don't have a lot of time, you need to deploy that fast, right? I would say the managed solutions is better. And why is it better? Not just from a speed perspective, but also from a security perspective, is because you don't need to worry about the control plane, right? The control plane, you don't have access to it. It has security defaults and it has security protection that's handled by your cloud provider, right? You of course you want to make sure that your cloud provider is doing the right choices, right? But you don't need to manage that. You don't need to worry about it, right? And they even have a cluster of control planes, so you're not relying on one VM or one machine to run your control plane, and if that goes down, everything stops working, right? So that's the second choice, I think, unmanaged and managed as well. And yeah, I think one other thing that people tend to forget a lot, and that's very crucial inside a Kubernetes cluster, is the what we call the RBAC, or role-based access control, right? It's like, I know it's kind of let's say it's kind of hard to understand in the beginning, but if you take a look at it, rollback is the main access control used by many different web applications, right? So you have the regular user role, you have the manager role, you have the admin role, right? It's basically that. It's just that Kubernetes doesn't have the users, right? It has the roles and the role bindings that you attach to the users that you want to access your cluster. So getting our back right, I think it's very important to reduce the blast radius and kind of reduce the attack surface of any compromise on your cluster as well.
It's pretty awesome. And I love the detail that you've gone into. So I hope someone takes away the important pieces that you've kind of dropped in as some little gems everywhere. So it's just all well and good, but I may have people who have probably, if this is the first time they listen to Kubernetes, like, oh my God, this is a technology which is going to be used for 5G and 6G. I need to learn about this. What do you recommend for people to start with learning?
So yeah, that's why I created this GitHub list, the awesome Kubernetes security list. It's basically a GitHub list with a bunch of links and resources and books and talks on how to start on Kubernetes and the Kubernetes basics, but then we go deep into Kubernetes security, right? And so I show presentations from previous conferences. I have listed some books that you can download for free. You just need to provide like an email or something, right? And some trainings as well. Like you have the KubeGoat from Madhu that was here a few sessions ago, right? So you can play around on your own and deploy a cluster even on your own machine and play around with that. So I think that's I would say I'm a bit biased, but that's the main resource, and I try to keep that as update as possible. And there's a lot of contributors already. I have over 10 people that submitted new links and contributed to this list. So I think it's pretty good right now.
Awesome. And I'll definitely make sure I'll have that link on the show notes as well for people to. But usually the easiest way, if someone's impatient, they can find Magno Logan on GitHub, and that's probably one of his popular repositories in there as well. It's pretty awesome. This is pretty awesome, man. I think and we definitely had one person who shouted out, Ahmad, and yeah, he definitely was. So he's definitely grateful that we were able to share that link. So hopefully that helps you, man. So last section, and this is our fun section. I know we've talked about attack, defense. We spoke about what a good maturity looks like. but I do want to know and give an opportunity for people to know you as a person as well. And a fun section is just 3 questions. And I know you've kind of heard this before as you're a regular of our show as well. So first one, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on Kubernetes, technology, and all of this?
Okay, yeah. I actually didn't thought about the responses for me for those questions. So yeah, that's a section that I look forward the most, and that sometimes I'm very curious to know more about the guests and the host there. But yeah, let me see.
Maybe drinking, is it Kasasha?
Cachaça, yeah. No, I'm not a heavy drinker. I drink like at least once or twice a week. Depends on the size of the cup, right? So that's why I have a big one.
Fair enough. You've done well, man. You've done well. I'm still going through this. You've done well.
Yeah, so here in Canada now, that's summertime, almost summertime, pretty much. So I like to go outdoors. I like to walk my dog to the park, and I love doing some Brazilian barbecue as well. So
nice.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I love Brazilian barbecue.
That's really awesome. Yeah.
Oh, actually, you know what? This is a good question. What do you feel is the difference between a regular barbecue and a Brazilian barbecue? Like, why it's because I just cannot explain it to my wife or anyone, but I'm hoping you can explain that.
I think the first thing that's different is the way that they cut the meat, right? So it's a bit different, right? So even if you cut the meat, it's different. It's even hard for us to find the proper meat cuts here in Canada, right? There's some names and some difference there. Another thing is usually with the Brazilian barbecue, it's usually like, okay, it's a real barbecue, right? It's real meat. It's not burgers, it's not sausages or hot dogs, right? The barbecue it's usually chicken or beef or pork, and it's like the seasoning of the meat as well. Like sometimes with red meat, we usually just put some salt on it, and that's it, right? We don't add any other seasoning or like barbecue sauce, anything like that. So that's pretty standard. And yeah, I think in the south of Brazil, that's like what they do every weekend, right? So I think that's very famous there as well.
What's your favorite meat cut for barbecue?
The meat cut for barbecue, I think, would be in Portuguese we say picanha, right? But in English it's the I forgot the name. It's the top. I forgot the name. So there's
that's all right. I'm sure people can Google out picanha as well.
Cap, some steak cap or something like that. I forgot the name. When I see it on the supermarket, then I get it, but I forgot the name.
Well, by the way, Jarl loves your Grogu figures. And how many is this question? Like this is, but how many do you have?
That's a good question. I think I have 2 big ones. There's 4 smaller ones. Actually, 6 smaller ones, and a medium one there. And I also have a Lego one that's out there.
Wow, there you go. You have found another common interest person over there.
Big fan of the Mandalorian.
Yeah, there you go. The next question: what is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
Okay, sure. I think something that I worked on for over 15 years, I think more than security, was martial arts. I did martial arts since 2003 until actually 2019, 2018. And I'm a 5th degree black belt in a martial art called ninjutsu, or Bujinkan Budo Taijutsu, right? It's a Japanese martial art based on what the samurais and the ninja trains before. So I think that's really awesome.
Wow. So wait, do you do whole sword fighting and everything?
Yeah.
Wow. So wait, was sword the main weapon for samurais, or was there something else as well in there?
For samurais, yeah, they usually had 2 swords, right? Like a regular katana sword, the katana, and the kodachi, right? The smaller one, right?
Yeah.
But for ninjas, right? They use any kind of weapon, right? The ninjas didn't care about the weapon itself. They only care about doing the job, right? Completing their mission, right? So they could use either a sword or like a stick or the shurikens, right? The ninja stars and all that stuff. So it's fun to play around with those. I haven't been doing lately because since I moved here to this city that I'm on in Canada, they don't have a gym. And right after I moved, the pandemic started, right? So I'm kind of in between there. But yeah, I've practiced in Brazil. I've practiced in Argentina. I went to Japan to get my 5th degree black belt as well in 2014. And I've also practiced in the US and Europe.
Wait, so you're actually saying, when as kids, I used to watch all the ninja mangas and anime, and I'm like, there is no way someone teaches this in real life. So they do teach this in real life.
Exactly. Do you know? I don't know if you know the series Ninja Jiraiya.
No, I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, Jiraiya. So the father of Jiraiya in that series, which is a famous Japanese series that I used to watch when I was a kid, the father of the mentor of the ninja Jiraiya is actually the master of ninjutsu. So he was kind of interpreting himself in that role there. So that's really nice. I can send you the link. They have the videos on YouTube. I can send you the link later.
I would definitely look forward to that, man. All right. Last question. What is your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Okay. So besides the Brazilian barbecue, I really like burritos, right? So
yes. A good burrito.
Exactly. So there are some good Mexican places around here, and it's similar to the Brazilian food as well. So you have rice, you have beans, you have salad, and you have meat. So it's everything combined together in one thing. So for me, it's very practical and it's very tasty. So I like that.
Oh my God, that definitely would make me hungry as well, man. Especially Brazilian barbecue. The more you mentioned it, and someone actually has the. Oh, they have it every day. Oh my God, Julio! Like you're having it every day. Oh my God.
Yeah, nice.
Both Magno and I are jealous of you, man. Like I think you definitely made us envious of what you have.
Yeah, exactly.
We have IT Ninja for real ninja. That is such true. That is pretty awesome, man. Sweet. So thanks so much for all this, all the time as well. And it seems that you're definitely like a crowd favorite as well here. Where can people reach you? And feel free to say in Portuguese as well, of course, for the Portuguese audience that's tuned in.
Sure. Yeah. I'm pretty much on most social networks as Magno Logan altogether, right? So either GitHub, LinkedIn, Twitter, it's all Magno Logan. So you can find me there. And feel free to reach me. And if you have any questions, anything around application security, container security, or cloud security, I'll be happy to talk about. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Now, thanks so much for coming on, man. I think I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience learned a lot as well. And I can't wait to have you back on again. For anyone else who's listening in, and if you enjoyed the conversation, we have conversation like this on cloud security every week. And every weekend we go live over here. So if you're someone who finds this valuable information, feel free to subscribe, and you would probably see someone like Magno come on again, and maybe some other people as well who can come and share some light on what cloud security could be. But thanks so much for everyone joining, and we'll see you next weekend. Thanks, Magno. I'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me.